Robin Mazumdar will explore the intersection between urban design, systemic oppression, and well-being. In his talk, he will discuss the Tulsa Race Massacre and the implications of the violence that took place on modern-day Tulsa and its citizens. This keynote is presented by the Oklahoma Highway Safety Office, Lubbock Taylor Family Foundation, and OU Urban Design Studio. Our speaker is Robin Mazumdar, who is an award-winning urban neuroscientist with an interest in understanding how living in cities impacts our well-being. And again, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature, and we will read the questions at the end. So Robin, take it away.
So I have about an hour, and there's just so much to say, and there's so much to learn. And thank you to Phil for educating me more about the legacy of the race massacre in Tulsa. When I was asked to get really hard about it because I'm not Black, I'm not American, and I have a lot of privilege, and I wanted to make sure that I showed up with my story in support of the story of Tulsa. That said, I'm not a historian of Tulsa or the race massacre, so I'm going to try and offer my perspective on it based on my life experiences and my education and training. I actually renamed the talk "A Storied Picture," and you'll find out why soon. But we're still going to talk about the same things. So I screenshotted Grace because I want to start with thank yous. And I'm in Mexico right now, in Mexico City. And here they say gracias. And I'm really fascinated by the kind of linguistics and the translations and the things you learn about your own language by learning another one. So I want to thank Jane for inviting me, and to Incog and Tulsa Planning. I want to make a very special thank you to my to some Indigenous elders in my life who have said that they have adopted me as their nephew. So that's Aunt Mona Plaka, Uncle Rupert Encinas, and Uncle Austin Nunez, all of whom are from Arizona. And I've had the opportunity to meet with them and learn from them about their traditions. And so I'm very grateful to Incog. I want to thank my ancestors. I'll get to that point. I want to thank your ancestors and our ancestors, because their struggles are what have allowed us to convene today and learn about how we can build our cities for everybody. So why am I here? Like I said, was invited by Jane, but I want to provide some context. I want to speak to my intention. And I also want to, we're talking about a race massacre, and I just want to put a trigger warning in because I was on a talk or a live stream with Kristen Jeffers, who's the Black urbanist, if you haven't heard of her. In her conversation a few days ago, she involved that. Why am I here? These are my parents. This is how I'm here. Asit Mazumdar and Shapna Mazumdar. In Bengali, we say Mojumdar. And this is, I got a Google image photos update saying, look at your memories, which is really interesting this morning. So I miss them dearly. I think they're tuning in from Victoria. So my dad's from Bangladesh and my mom is from India. And I was born in Toronto. And I'm using images here of places that I've lived or have been that speak to the issue at hand, which is essentially how we're policed in public space. In this case, in Toronto, Clive Mensa was tasered in his own backyard. That's where I was born. And I did my master's in Toronto, and I was actually part of the Pride Parade when BLM showed up and made their statements and requests and demands for involving Black trans people more within the Pride Parade, which essentially had become a corporate parade. And that's what really got me starting to think while I was in occupational therapy school about this intersection. We were held up for 3 hours. I had no idea what was going on. And then later learned that this was happening. We were way back at the end of the parade. But to speak to this notion of violence in our streets, this is a screenshot of an article from 2018 on how Bangladeshi students were protesting the streets due to road violence. And I actually have a pretty personal connection to that because when I was a kid, we went to Bangladesh and India as a family. And I watched my parents and my sister get run over by a truck while they were in a rickshaw and I was behind them. So when we're talking about violence in our streets, we have to acknowledge the trauma that is embedded within them. And clearly, Tulsa has a lot of trauma embedded within its built environment, and a legacy and the history and even the soil on which that city is built. You know, it has that legacy of bodies. I'll just leave it at that. So that was my experience from Bangladesh as a kid. But something that was really quite overwhelming, I learned about Tulsa, which I did not know about until Jane sent me this email to invite me. I was educated in Canada, where we don't even learn about the history of residential schools, so let alone what happens in the United States. You know, be hard pressed. But my dad survived a genocide, and it was in 1971 in Bangladesh. And you see a little bit of a collage of pictures here. It's the U.S. can't remember and Bangladesh can't forget. So there's this kind of theme of people forgetting about death, and it's actually the death toll or the impact of this genocide, and it's actually the 50th anniversary this year, and it's disputed as to how many people died, but they think 3 million. And so I think my dad's watching, and I'm just in awe of how he survived that at 16. And I would say maybe he can correct me after, but I think I'm born of a revolutionary spirit because he actually was part of the freedom fighters. And my mom came to Canada in the 70s and experienced tremendous racial violence in Revelstoke, BC, as I think one of two brown families. My grandfather was worked for the railway, and his best friend, as I understand it, was black. They were the only two, I think, people of color on that railway team. And he spent 60 years walking through the snow and fixing tracks. So that's a little bit of my history. And this is where I'm from, the most doomed city in Canada, Victoria, BC. And what's interesting about this is that this structure, the Empress Hotel, is obviously of a colonial legacy, and it was built on Indigenous peoples' land, specifically the Lekwungen and the Esquimalt peoples. And one other kind of note about this is that this building is sinking because they built it on a marsh. Similarly, I'm in Mexico City, and it was founded by the Mexica people in 1325, and the buildings here are sinking too because they built it on a lake. So I don't know if this is some kind of theme of colonists building beautiful architecture on hallowed ground that's also sinking. And then to talk about Tulsa, like I said, I'm not a historian of Tulsa, and I've read up and listened to podcasts and learned a lot from Phil, but this is just an interesting picture or slide because it speaks to the legacy of the peoples on this land. So to get to the topic of the conference, I added the story of. So unraveling the story of inequity in our streets. And I love the fact that you use the word our because it speaks to ownership of public space. So this has been a really rough week, and I'll tell you about it. This is a picture I took on Monday. I was walking to the Office Max in Coyoacán, a predominantly white neighborhood in Mexico City, essentially is a suburb of Mexico City, which has now just become a part of it, I guess. And I was going to buy an office chair to sit down and really start to focus on this talk and immerse myself. And on my way over to the Office Max, which is about like a 10-minute walk, I saw this street and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the first street I've seen that has traffic calming. You can't see it here, but there's a speed bump like way down the road. So I was like, well, that's really interesting. Maybe I can bring that up in my talk. So I walked over to the speed bump and I watched the cars go by and how fast they went, and it worked. And I was like, this is really interesting. So I took a picture of that. And then I looked to my left and I saw this house. And I was like, holy moly, that's the coolest color combination I've ever seen. As a neuroscientist who studies perception and the effect of colors and aesthetics on your psychology, I was like, this is a really good picture to take for my talk. And if you look at this house, you can see some fences at the top, and maybe to the left there, I think those are probably some form of barbed wire. So following taking this picture, I was well on my way to go to pick up this office chair. And this is the last picture I took as I was talking to my friend on WhatsApp because I was stopped by a police officer. And at first I thought it was because of my cubre de boca, my mask being on my chin, because I was outside and my face was getting hot. It was pretty hot. I take little breaks here and there when we're outside. And he comes over to me, this pretty big police officer. And my Spanish is más o menos. Yo habla poco español. I've only been here for like 4 months and really have spoken it with intention for 2. And he starts getting in my face, and he essentially, are you taking pictures? And I was like, I'm a neuroscientist who studies architecture and urban design, and I'm giving a keynote on Friday. This guy does not know anything I'm talking about, and I'm not even saying it clearly. So he starts getting agitated. I'm freaking out because I've had negative experiences with the police in the past. I've been detained by the police. I've been carded, and so there's a legacy, or there's a history of trauma with that too. So I'm trying to manage my body and not pull my phone out because I was scared of that. He had a gun on him, and so then he finally understands what I'm doing, and then he starts searching me. He sticks his hands in my pockets. He sticks his fingers to my wallet. I have an AirPod case. I'm using AirPods, and has black sand on it from the beach. It just stuck in there. And he was trying to rub that off and smell it, like he thought that I was on drugs or had drugs on me. I had my wallet because I was trying to buy this office chair. So by the end of it, and I've heard things about police in Mexico, and it's interesting here because when I'm in Canada, or when I'm in the United States, or when I'm in Europe, and I've been stopped by the police and bothered by them, I just make the assumption it's because I'm dark skinned. And in Mexico City, I have people all over Mexico, and I've been here for 4 months. I've had people come up to me in the streets, think, "Oh, Moreno, Moreno." They like love the color of my skin. There's also a legacy of racism towards Afro-Mexicano people. And my understanding is that they are descendants of slaves who survived shipwrecks. So it's a really complex situation in Mexico as it pertains to race. And for me, it was actually quite not only scary, but disappointing, because I was telling my friend the other day that I forgot that I was a dark-skinned person in Mexico. So here it says ambiguity on this orange chair with a bag of cheese and bread on it. And I'm wearing a tank top that says "Wet'su Wetin Strong." That's from British Columbia. And these are Indigenous peoples who are water protectors. And an activist challenging the government's building of a pipeline. And it's from a few years ago, but that's where I'm from. So someone told me, hey, maybe it's because it was what you were wearing. And I was like, I was trying not to wear something that was looking flashy. I was just wearing a tank top and shorts and sandals. And he's, we're trying to figure out why this happened. I think we know why it happened, but the next day I was going to take a Uber or something to the Office Max and wear like like a suit essentially. And then I was like, you know what? No. So I wore my tank top and I walked down there, I grabbed my chair and I literally carried it home. People are staring at me like I'm crazy, but I didn't want to take a cab. I took all these pictures in the neighborhood that I live in. I felt that I was entitled to taking those pictures. And when you look at what's happening in Mexico with police brutality, there's a lot of things popping up. And I just thought it was very interesting contrast given what I was invited to speak about. But what's really interesting is I'm actually at a hotel in downtown Mexico City, right next to the cathedral, which is also next to an Aztec ceremonial place and Aztec temple, which they almost built over. So there's a really interesting kind of theme and narrative of building over other people's places and destroying them. But I had to walk to another hotel this morning because the internet at that hotel was not working. So at 7 a.m., I'm walking over, and I needed an escort to walk over. It was a 10-minute walk at 7 in the morning, which in Victoria, BC, I wouldn't think twice about. But we're adjacent to Tepito. And if you know much about Mexico City, Tepito is one of the most dangerous neighborhoods like on the planet. So it's just fascinating to me that I needed his help because of a context of poverty and crime and what I see as a response to a colonial legacy of oppression. And I've seen both sides of the story here. And that's what I'm learning more about Tulsa. And so I'm going to get to my background and it provides more context on my perspective. So as I mentioned, I did my master's in Toronto, but I did it in occupational therapy. And what's interesting about occupational therapy is that it's essentially a fusion of 4 professions: social work, a doctor, and importantly, an architect. It was an architect that brought this group of people together in, I think, 1918 in Chicago, because they recognized that they were starting to build buildings and that there was a health aspect to it. So occupational therapists are essentially architectural healthcare professionals. I spent 5 years working in clinical mental health. I worked at an inpatient schizophrenia unit in Toronto, which is where I really started to recognize this intersection of race, mental health, poverty, and then how the city in which these institutions like CAMH or whatever, or community mental health, how the city itself influenced the mental health of the patients that I was working with, because I noticed that in some places, some people were more stressed out, and in other places, they were happier. And fundamentally, that is what my research was about. And that's where I would take people from an environment like this to help them survive, I would say, in an environment like this. And then I worked in Edmonton on a community mental health team where I worked in an environment like this. And I started to see this connection between design and mental health, specifically because of one patient that I worked with who had attempted suicide because he was lonely. And I went for a walk with him around his neighborhood, again, using this architectural environmental perspective on health. And I saw that there was really nowhere for him to meet people. It was impossible for him to get to the city center from the fringes of the city where he was living, where these boarding homes were. And I essentially burnt out because I recognized that I wasn't really doing anything in my capacity on an individual level to address something like urban design. So I quit that job and I ran a startup accelerator for a year randomly. I don't know how I got the job, but I did. And there was one particular training that I received, and it was through the Stanford D School. And they taught us about this cycle of the design cycle, and the green hexagon at the top says empathize. And I recognized that perhaps this person that I worked with who had tried taking a life because they were so lonely, their needs weren't particularly empathized with when it came to the design of their community or their house or the social service organization that was supporting them. So that was when I had this aha moment that I wanted to dedicate my life to really focusing on what empathy means, but to measure that, and to also measure how people respond to their environments. So I quit that job too, and I left to do my PhD at the University of Waterloo, where I did research that looks like this. People would be in virtual reality. I would measure their physiological responses, but it was really just trying to measure how people responded to space. I'm not going to get into the details of my thesis. I actually don't want to look at the thing for at least 2 years. But what I looked at was how tall buildings impacted people's mental health, or their psychological state, I should say. Whether being in environments with buildings like this one, or many of them, if that created a sense of discomfort. And I will tell you that in Mexico City, I have not spent much time at all around the tall buildings. The neighborhood I'm in right now is max 3 stories. And I can feel the difference. But it just some kind of reflections on my dissertation, particularly the discussion section, was thinking about vertical urbanization, the conceptions in the city, why we have to build buildings so high. Yes, density is important. However, if you look at the size of parking lots, let's say in a city like Houston, and the proportion of land that's dedicated to cars and to freeways, as Phil mentioned earlier in his talk, but the freeway that basically destroyed a neighborhood. What are our priorities? And so I started reading sociology and anthropology and all this other stuff around this issue of skyscrapers. And there's someone named Parker, I think from Sheffield in the UK, and he said that skyscrapers are capital made durable. And that's why I chose the picture that I did. And the last piece here is, what would psychology be like that measured the mental and physical damages caused by capitalism? Again, reflecting on Tulsa, I'm reflecting on Mexico City and Victoria. In any city really, is to see how capitalism really shapes the city. And the fact that Black Wall Street was burnt down makes me think quite a bit about how we can capitalism that was modeled in 1921 in this beautiful neighborhood, which I wish I could have visited and would probably use as an example for the talks I give. But there's this complexity to the city, and my dissertation while I was in cognitive neuroscience really made me realize that the city is not just about space itself. This is Central Park, as you all probably know, and it was built on Seneca Village, which I understand to be it was a community of Black people, I think Portuguese, perhaps, and immigrants. And Frederick Olmsted, who's lauded as the godfather of park design and was one of the first landscape architects that really intentionally brought in psychology. And I've been to Central Park, and it's great, but it was built on someone else's home. And I think it's worth taking a second to think about this intersection of what we think cities need and who's displaced because of it. And from a psychological perspective, there's all this research about how green space is good for your mental health. And this is just a diagram from a paper from Silent from 2015, which kind of speaks to what's going on beneath the surface or in your brain when you are in green space. However, I was really made to think about this because I've had experiences in green spaces where I have not felt safe. And so as a person of color, a non-Black person of color who's a scientist in a field that's dominated by white men, I felt it was important to bring my experiences from the traumas I've experienced to where I'm from, the color of my skin, and to get positive things to my research as a neuroscientist. And I came to this realization that green space must be non-threatening and public space must be non-threatening. But what does that mean? You know, it's not just about traffic calming design. And these are reflections I have based on Black thought. People like Jay Pitter, Kristen Jeffries, Charles Brown, who I see is on the panel later today, who I was on a panel with last year. You know, people like Dr. Julian Ajman, who is a mentor of mine who does research on injustice. So I just want to really credit that, because I'm constantly learning, and these conversations that aren't particularly easy are actually the ones that make you grow the most. This brings me to why I started thinking about this, and actually wrote a theory paper on an intersectional approach to urban design that I call experiential equity. But it was what W.E.B. Du Bois said in 1903, but I think it was an Atlantic article that was published in 1897. He spoke to this notion of double consciousness, and he said it was a sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. I've been talking fast, I'm just saying a lot, but I just really want people to sit with that. I'm very grateful that he was bold and brave, and I mean, I think he's a genius, and to do what he did in his time is a great inspiration. But the point that he's making, that I understand from the perspective of a neuroscientist, is that it actually takes cognitive resources. When you experience racism or misogyny or any kind of oppression, when you're in public space and you can't take a picture of a building, or you can't literally just exist, as we've seen from countless Black people being murdered in the streets all over the world just for existing, is W.E.B. Du Bois that really kind of made me realize there's actually a psychological thing that you can measure here. And my intention is to really do research that measures the experiences that are often gaslighted, erased, or not even acknowledged. Which brings me to intersectionality, which I think is a really interesting spatial term, as someone who studies space. But it's Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality that helped me develop a way or methodology to really look at the variables of our identity that other people use to keep us subjugated or oppressed. How do those intersections manifest in your experience in the world? Which brings me to racism-related vigilance from the late Dr. Rodney Clark. Dr. Rodney Clark studied responses to racial threat in mostly Black and Latinx people in the US, but he found that there's actually a physiological response in terms of your blood pressure, arterial elasticity, and all of these things have an impact on your body. And I've always known that when I've been in situations where I experience racism, my heart rate goes through the roof, certainly going through the roof on Monday with that police officer. And these have consequences. It's not just a momentary panic, it's constant stress. And that was the focus of my research from a purely spatial and architectural perspective. But now I'm recognizing more and more after reading Dr. Rodney Clark's work, particularly, that the consequences of a racist society are subtle, from microaggressions to the terrible massacre in Tulsa. It's a spectrum of oppression, and they all have their consequences. And I have an article here about Christian Cooper, the Black birder who was harassed by this woman here for telling her that her dog shouldn't be off leash in a place that had a lot of birds that were being killed by dogs. Some interesting commentary in that. So that brings me to my concept that I've just recently submitted to a textbook. It's being published by Policy Press, and it's on urban design responses to the pandemic. And I wanted to talk about how the pandemic happened at the same time as the Black Lives Matters protests, and this intersection of how people experience public space. Like I said, when I was stopped by this police officer, I thought that it was because my mask wasn't on. So this is a kind of new layer to our experience of public space. But at the same time, people were dying at the hands of police. So I was made to really think about that. And you know, I've been talking to other friends of mine who are people of color, and Black friends, when you wear a mask and sunglasses, it's intimidating to people who might see you as a threat based on how they've been conditioned, or their biases or their prejudices, or the fact that they just might be straight up racist and they know it. So to protect the public good, and I'm obviously, as a scientist, I believe in the vaccine and I believe in COVID, but some people are putting themselves at risk just by virtue of having to protect themselves against the virus, but they're putting themselves in danger of something else when it comes to the perception of threat or blackness or whiteness, or in my case, brownness, and the ambiguity associated with that. So I said that the term experiential equity establishes that achieving equity is not solely about improving access to urban infrastructure, but also how one experiences urban infrastructure. It applies a psychospatial lens to experiences of discrimination in public space. So we're looking at psychological responses, we're looking at physiological responses, we're looking at posture. Proxemics is the study of the space that people keep between themselves and other people or objects. You know, getting a qualitative understanding of what people's experiences are as someone who did their master's using phenomenology and grounded theory and more of like an interview style, and doing my PhD using pure just measurement. There's definitely value in both. People aren't just numbers. And the variables that we look at are, you know, the spatial variables, how wide streets are, how wide is that highway, how loud is it highway because of how wide it is, what's the color as per the picture I took that got me in trouble with the police, the complexity of the images, but also importantly, what does surveillance look like? And who's surveilling? And how do you move around the city? And what do you look like? What infrastructure is there? And will the infrastructure that should perhaps be in this, on this road here, would that actually protect a Black woman riding a bike? And Tamika Butler has really taught me a lot about that as well. And she's written some great stuff. And if you are interested, I would look her up. This is really interesting space. This is in King's Cross, where I lived close to when I was doing a fellowship at the University College of London in London. It looks like a public space, but it's actually a private space. And there's a certain type of person that's there. And it's, as you can see, it's policed. And this conversation on public and private space, as I mentioned, I've had many run-ins with the police and security guards. And for my dissertation, I was actually in Toronto taking pictures of buildings on the sidewalk. And this is in Canada. I'm in Toronto. I'm an hour and a half away from Waterloo. And I was harassed by this guy for half an hour. And then another guy came out and I asked them why I was being stopped. He's like, well, you can't take a picture of the building because you're on private property. If you can look at this picture here, it's not delineated as a sidewalk on Bay Street in Toronto in the business district. So a brown guy taking pictures of a building, and I think at that time, I think I had a big beard. Perhaps, you know, they thought I was trying to, I don't know, whatever a brown person with a beard would do. And the same thing happened to me when I was in London taking similar pictures. And actually they came out and said that it was because of the history of bombings in London that they were giving me a hard time. And I showed them my papers and then they let me do my thing. But the point being is I've had numerous experiences trying to do my work in public space just by taking pictures. And I'm confused at this point about the delineation between private space and public space. And it's something that I think our cities need to consider from like a zoning perspective. How much ownership does a business have on an ambiguous piece of sidewalk, and how much control they can have of the people who use that space to get to and from work or to do whatever they need to do. I did an experiment, was looking at how women experience public space. And I read this article about man slamming, which is essentially that men just don't get out of the way when they walk. And if a woman holds her ground, then they get knocked over. And there was a piece in Refinery 21 where like 6 women of a diverse backgrounds did this, and they like said, you know, 6 times, and actually I hurt my shoulder, and it was just ridiculous to me. So I did an experiment on it. So I had people walk up and down a sidewalk, and this person that was designed, I didn't have much choice over. The person who made our this virtual world just made that. So yeah, I guess he's racially ambiguous, but that wasn't really intentional on my part. But what we did was we saw how close people or how many collisions they had with this virtual avatar, and I coded it using an intersectional framework and methodology to look at how women and people of color, if this was true about white men not getting out of the way. And what's interesting, I haven't published it yet, but we found that, but specifically women of color actually gave the most space. This is statistically significant, but they gave the most space to this avatar. And we'll have to do some more follow-up research on it to get a better qualitative understanding of what the experience is and why that might be. But just walking up and down a sidewalk can be an experience full of micro and macro aggressions. And then you look at pedestrians and where they die in the United States, it's in poor Black neighborhoods. And so I just trying to show you this very, to elucidate the complexities of just going for a walk. This is a slide. It's of a model on something called dignity encounters, and it was something I learned about when I worked at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, because we had a peer support worker on the team, and the peer support worker is someone who with a mental illness who used to be at the hospital and now works as part of this team to help us understand the patient experience. And he said, "Listen, we became best friends. His name is Jeremiah." And he said, every single second that you spend with a mental health patient at this institution, some of whom have lived here for 40 years because they've been institutionalized, these are people who have completely lost their dignity. The healthcare system had made them feel like they had no agency. Most of them are people of color, so they just get beat up 24 hours a day. So when you spend time with them, try to be conscious of how you can support their dignity. And you can do that through the way you speak to them. You can do it through the way you look at them. You can do that by the way you speak about them. I had to tell some nurses not to say rude things about patients right in front of them because, all these little microaggressions are little cuts to these people. So essentially, I took that dignity encounter concept and started looking into how the built environment of our cities can support dignity. Because fundamentally, I don't think building a city that's happy or joyful or anything matters unless people fundamentally feel dignified as they move through it. And when we look at the design of cities, you see things like this. So these are homeless spikes. I'm sure many of you have heard of this or seen these. These are very obvious, and they're just meant so that people don't sleep or sit on these benches, particularly homeless people. This is less obvious. This is in Camden, which was close to King's Cross Station, which I mentioned I was living nearby in London in the UK. First look, this is a really cool kind of architectural, funky art bench, but it's actually useless. It's very uncomfortable to sleep on or sit on. And so there are these subtle kind of cues in our environment as to who is allowed to participate in the city or particularly some public spaces. You see garbage like this. I don't know who designed this, but they're not winning any awards. So I'm going to wrap it up soon because I really want to actually have a conversation with the audience if possible. Hopefully we have some questions because I'm interested to learn from you. But ways to facilitate experiential equity, public space design. So on the right, this is a mural of Major Taylor. I took this picture when I was giving a talk in Denver a couple of years ago, and he was one of the first. I think he's the first Black racing cyclist. You can imagine how difficult that must have been, the barriers he faced. And I brought up intercultural negotiation. It's a term that I mentioned Dr. Julian Ajman's name earlier, and he speaks about that when he talks about what the role of public space is and how you can have many people from many backgrounds together. And I have a bit of an issue with how Canada kind of brands itself as like a melting pot or a diverse society, but fundamentally there's a dominant culture and everyone else has to work around that. So there's no negotiation. You just show up, and it's not about this kind of collage of people. We have to negotiate these things. We have to have conversations, and some people might not want a park designed with small tables and water basins where you can't wash your dishes. And I say that because when I was living in Edmonton, which is a city in Alberta in northern Canada, I talked to a multicultural urban planner, and they said that there was a park in northern Edmonton where they would go there all the time and they'd find the tables pushed together, they can figure it out. So one day they went to see what happened in the Somali community, which is quite big in Edmonton. They would spend their weekends, having picnics, and they were multi-family parties. It's a collectivist culture, much like my own. Some of my favorite memories of when I was a kid was going for these massive potlucks in the park with Indian and Bangladeshi women wearing saris, and we would stink up the park with our curry, and it was a way to claim the space, but also particularly for immigrant communities to be seen. As I've seen in the past, year, I think last year I read an article about how Black people having barbecues in the park get the police call on them. So this is across the board and in different intensities, something that people experience. So how do you have a conversation about cultural negotiation, how things are designed, but importantly art? And I was so stoked to hear about what's happening with Greenwood Rising. The use of art, I think, much like you see here with Major Taylor, makes a statement. And on the left here, ways to ways to facilitate experiential equity. I just screenshotted Kristen's website. She's a Black urbanist, and if you want to facilitate experiential equity, bring in people like her to help you understand the complexity of the human experience, and not that it's a cookie cutter approach to urban design. Obviously, policing is something I've talked a lot about, and lastly, addressing fear through design and policy. And fear from a neuroscientific perspective, I think is interesting to consider when it comes to design. This is from the, I think, Tulsa World newspaper. I don't know if the writing's too small here, but this, I understand, is Chris Skur, who is one of the muralists or creators of the mural. But when I was reading the article, I saw this, and I'll just read it out. So it's Poppy Kelly, an Edison High School teacher, was walking the length of the mural, and he said that when he learned about what Greenwood really was, it wasn't a place where Blacks once lived and had to go off to live and survive somewhere else, Kelly said. So I think art has such a profound effect on our psychology from an aesthetic perspective. As I mentioned, in Mexico City, I'm running around taking pictures of all the houses I see because it's so beautiful. But I also think it makes a statement. And fundamentally, I think that's what art is all about. And when you see the intersection of making a statement with colors and aesthetics about what was there or what could be there or what we should feel when we're in a place where we don't know the history, to me, as someone who likes getting things done quickly, murals and every public art installations, these sorts of things, pop-up art, I think are ways to really quickly start conversations and confuse people who might actually, we would consider racist, to have them be compelled by the beauty of art, but then think about what that art does. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm really excited to hear about this. And I'm also a big fan of John Legend. So I hope to come to Tulsa. I was actually hoping to come this time around, but it's a pandemic. I updated this talk as Phil was talking. If you look at this, I just love the term pathway to hope. It's a spatial term, a pathway, and hope is something that we need when we learn about tragedies like the Tulsa race massacre or the Bangladeshi genocide or the history of genocide in Canada when it comes to Indigenous peoples and Black people too. There were slaves in Canada that no one talks about. I was so moved by this, I had to take a picture very quickly. We see reconciliation and we see hope and we see a pathway and we see a Black Wall Street memorial. The linguistics, the terminology, the names and the words that are used to describe this gives me hope, and I thought it was really beautiful. I'm really quite excited to see what that looks like. I mentioned fear earlier, and if you're an oppressed person, you know that oppression and fear are very linked. How can we alleviate fear? Like I said, art and obviously road design, accommodating people, but considering that intersection again of identity and urban design should be considered. And I just wanted to put this in here for people who haven't read up on the neuroscience of fear. Essentially, it's the feeling of being afraid. It involves defensive behaviors, which includes anger. And I think that speaks to why people oppress in the first place. Fundamentally, in my experiences with anyone who's given me a hassle and some of the terrible experiences I've had of racism, I just know that they're scared. We live in a society where we're constantly bombarded by things that scare us or should scare us or are meant to scare us. And that keeps us in a state of constantly feeling agitated and irritable and reactive. And something to consider about how we create harmony in our cities, the way people move through cities, from driving to riding a bike to walking. If we can make that a seamless experience, then we're actually allowing people's bodies to relax, which might give them a second to reflect on saying something rude to someone on the street. You know, when people are in a state of fear, their brains aren't that great. They don't think straight. But fundamentally, it's a perceived threat, so it's perceived, but it's in our external environment for the most part. I know we can generate our own fear and get anxious with self-reflection through rumination, but it's the external environment that I'm particularly interested in. And like I mentioned earlier, anger, which as much hope as I have, I think we live in an angry society. I understand fear as a response to vulnerability as much as I do with anger. And so dignity is important, but I would love to have conversations about what it means to create spaces where people can be vulnerable to the extent that perhaps they can sleep in public space. And that's a very important place for me to end, because I'm working on a project right now in Victoria where we're housing people who are currently sleeping rough or living in parks. We're using shipping containers. It's called Hey Neighbor. We're painting them with muralists are painting it. We're really hoping for this to be a beautiful space. And that's what I see. That's what I saw in Phil's presentation. And that's what I see in the future of Tulsa is a beautiful space, hopefully, where we can all live in harmony, where we can have the difficult conversations we need to have so that people aren't harassed by the police constantly, where police might be seen as figures of safety for everybody. And again, I'm just so grateful and honored to have been able to share this with you. And thanks for the opportunity. And I'm looking forward to taking some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. We do have a comment and a few questions here. Anjanette says, for so many years, Black people were chastised, broken apart for grouping together. Now we have the concept of public spaces for the Black community in Tulsa. We need more free and public space to congregate and speak freely. And so of talking about that, could you maybe go into how physiological responses to different built environments like bike lanes, sidewalks, busy streets, how we can learn more about those bodily responses to the design of our streets?
That's a great question. I wrote down speak freely when it came to the use of public space, which is important for protest. But when it comes to physiological responses, what's interesting about our methodology in our lab, I worked with Dr. Colin Ellard, who's my supervisor. We use something called the electrodermal activity or the galvanic skin response, which is essentially just how much you sweat on your palms, where you have a high density of eccrine sweat glands, and the evolutionary psychology behind that suggests that it was used to climb trees, but now we just sweat on our palms and don't know what to do about it, or our armpits, or the front of our face, or our forehead. But we measure that, and what's interesting is that people sometimes, in my experience with my research and Colin's experience with his research, people will subjectively say that they're okay, but their body response is just saying that they're super stressed out. And sometimes I think we can kind of put that on other people when it just might be because you've been walking down a noisy road for an hour and your ears hurt and your body's responding and you're just trying to get home, but you can't ride your bike because there's no infrastructure and the bus system is terrible. So these are the sorts of things I think we need to consider. Like I said earlier, these things add up and can have implications on our, how our heart works.
Cool, thank you. We have another question here from Barbara. Have you worked with Dan Burden on your walking audits to look at how urban space is designed or not, if it's not designed for pedestrians?
No, I have not, but I'll look them up.
So I have a question here from Emily. In your work focusing on inequity in the built environment, and particularly about spaces that lack empathy, while it's very important to understand how our spaces do not promote empathy, can you describe some ways that we can promote empathy and dignity in our public spaces or built environment? And I guess this goes to, are there any, in our practice day-to-day of work, what are some easy, small takeaways that we can use to start building a better environment?
What a nice question. I think we just have to ask ourselves what makes us happy. I think reflective practice is extremely important. So think about the things that you experience in cities that give you joy, and then maybe think about ways that experience could compel two complete strangers to have a conversation. And I've seen formal art exhibits in cities that facilitate conversations, which is what I think is necessary for empathy. And there was actually, in Toronto, there was this really interesting thing. I mean, I don't even know if they do that now with the pandemic, but you could speak into this crazy kind of maze of tubes on one side, and on the other side, a complete stranger could listen to you. And I experienced an abstraction of that when I was at Burning Man a few years ago, and they had this thing where you just pick up the phone and talk to a random stranger and just understand what their experience was completely anonymously. So all of the visual elements were kind of removed, and you could just have a conversation with someone you don't know what they look like and understand their perspective. So I think there's just really, there could be some really creative ways to just facilitate conversations. Is that, I feel like I kind of rambled a bit, but does that answer Emily's question?
So it kind of sounds like what you're saying is just get people at the table, which kind of goes back to what Paul Armstrong, he made a comment that they started and sat down with the community to tell their stories, to get input. So that kind of sounds like what you're saying is just get community buy-in, more than just the usual suspects, but really need to go seek out those conversations.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing. So my friend Kay Gal, who's actually work on Mexico City, but she's in Victoria where I grew up. And I went for a walk with her and looked at some of her murals, and I was asking her about her process. And what she does is she shows up and has a conversation with the local community, particularly people who are at the risk of being displaced, to understand what their story is and then tell that story through a mural. And by the same time, we had a conversation about how she was worried that art was what was going to cause gentrification and displace these people that she was arguably trying to support. And I just reminded her that you can't blame art. I think we have to look at zoning policies and other sorts of other aspects of politics that make it easy for someone to tear down a house and build what we consider good density, but not make it affordable for the people whose house was torn down. So it's just, the consultation piece is super important.
We just have a little time left. Here's a great question. Oh, by the way, we do have a comment. Let's see, someone here. Let's see, Rachel, amazingly thought-provoking. Wish I could take Mr. Mazunga for several lunches. Thank you. So you got some hands.
Oh, wow. Okay. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate
awesome. That. Here you go. Thank you so much for sharing your family and their new story with us. Wanted to say your career path is fascinating and so incredibly important. The intersection of so much commingles in the built environment. Amazing to know there are folks studying the science of it all. I'm curious to see what spaces you look to for hope, and are there public spaces that you look to for best practices?
Ooh, yeah, thank you for the comment and the question. Spaces that give me hope. I mean, it's in Winnipeg. It's the people have a field day with it, and it's a very divisive art gallery, art museum, but it's actually. It's for reconciliation. Winnipeg's a city with a very, 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 I think it's the highest concentration of urban indigenous peoples. And when you go in there, it's a story that you experience and you get to the top. And I think that, it's like looking, the psychological research on art suggests that there's a line that you follow with your eyes as you get to the point that the artist is really wanting you to focus on, if it's intentional. And I think that experience in the gallery really showed me that architecture literally forces your body to move in a certain direction, or design does, and then your eyes move around too. And so these experiences can cause, feelings of joy or awe. And awe is an interesting emotion, I guess, or feeling that is inspired by design, specifically monumental and religious art, or it's called RMA, religious and monumental architecture. And so spaces with big ceilings, like the one I'm in right now, if I was in a room that was like with the ceiling right over my head, I'd be feeling quite claustrophobic, which is what my research is about. So the Winnipeg Museum, for reconciliation, I think, is one place, but also just, when I was in London, I would spend a lot of time at Hampstead Heath. And it's just this massive park where you can go sit by yourself and no one's going to bother you. Hopefully not the police. But, green space and architecture, both, which is architecture is essentially man-made, though both these things can inspire awe. And I think awe is closely linked to hope. So yes.
Let's see, here's one from Rachel. It says, streets, sidewalks, bike lanes are taxpayer-funded right-of-ways for the purpose of traversing from point A to B. Many of these right-of-way or easements, and some in the case, highways and interstates are owned by the State Department of Transportation. These public spaces may include benches for seating for rest between 2 points. These are not funded for sleeping. Parks are taxpayer funded for the enjoyment of the population. These also include benches. Design of benches are shown in your slides to prevent sleeping and prolonged use. Certainly drive users to fit within the funded scope of the right-of-way or recreational park. Do you propose a change to the definition of public in regards to the use of right-of-way and recreational areas?
I mean, I think that's very contextual and subjective based on the city. It's a really good question, and I think I probably have like a minute to answer it. But you know, one thing that in Mexico, I mean, I was studying a facade, and the facade is a skin of a wall of a home that's a private space. And so, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you know, outside of your private domicile, everything should be considered public space. That's my opinion. I know that's probably not likely in many cities, given how many corporate sponsorships we have on what we consider parks. But you know, like there's a place in Toronto where there's a coffee shop and a big square in the middle. There's like a cool piece of art, but it turns out that that's actually private space. So I think we need to get rid of that or find ways to make those spaces less policed by the people who own them.
Well, our time is up. Robin, thank you so much for your perspective. Quite interesting.